Well, if you have your notes in front of you, turn it over to the section called Psychotropic Drugs and Biblical Counseling. How do we deal with that? Now, you understand that, especially if you come out of the medical field, there's no way in the world that we're going to be able to exhaustively cover all the circumstances that could occur in counseling in a short 50-minute time period, but at least we want to give you an introduction. And there's a lot that I do want to say that hopefully will be of help to you from a biblical perspective. So let's get into this, and there's some of this that's early part of my remarks that actually Dr. Baker is going to cover in a later session on physical issues in the body and the human body and those kind of things. So I'm not going to spend a long time belaboring some of those points because he's going to cover them much more thoroughly. But we do want to introduce them as part of the whole picture of mankind. That's what we want to do. So if you want to pull your notes out and get your Bibles ready, that's what we want to do. Let's talk about what the Bible has to say about physical issues. Physical and spiritual aspects of counseling is what we're really dealing with. And the Bible gives us reasons for actual organic problems. That is, ailments, sicknesses, those kind of things. Remember how I said in an earlier session, there is no such thing as mental illness. Mental illness is an oxymoron. It's like jumbo shrimp, right? Or military intelligence, those kind of things. Couple of terms that don't go together. I just alienated all the military people in the audience, didn't I? Well, I come out of the Air Force. I was in the Air Force for 6 years, so I know that I'm a part of that. So I guess it qualifies me to be able to say something. But oxymorons, that's mental illness. Now, there is such thing as actual physical illness. In fact, Luke himself was a member of the disciples, and he certainly was a physician. And the Bible gives us reasons why there is sickness. For example, in Genesis chapter 3, Romans 5, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, the reason why we live in a world with sickness and ailment is because we live in a sin-cursed environment. And death is now a part of that environment. Originally, man and woman was designed to live forever. Life without end. But then sin was introduced. And actually, death was an act of mercy by God, because to live perpetually in a world of sin would have been hell. And so death becomes an actual act of mercy from God to bring our life to an end here and now, to show you that there is a different way to live eternally in a sinless environment. That's the way that God intended it from the very beginning. So Genesis 3, Romans 5, Hebrews 9:27 says we live in a world of sickness because we live in a world of sin. But we also know as well that their sin or sickness can be sin engendered. We can see that in James chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. And some of this can be a part of the natural consequences of sin. For example, a person that misuses drugs over a period of time, whether they're legal or illegal drugs, doesn't matter. Eventually, those drugs misuse are going to take a toll on the physical body. Or there's an abuse of alcohol, and that person becomes a drunkard, and eventually they suffer from cirrhosis of the liver. Or you can internalize things that are going on in your life, strife, stress, all of that is internalized, and eventually you develop some sort of heart disease because of that, all of that internalized stress. All of that has to do with unbiblical responses to life. Someone has not helped you to know how to respond to those difficult times in life. That's hard. So you can drive dangerously because you're angry, sinfully angry, down the freeway and get in an accident, and now you suffer a broken leg or worse, a broken pelvis, and then now you suffer from that for the rest of your life. There's going to be an abnormality there. That's a sin-engendered thing. Well, Also, it can be a result of unbiblical responses like anger. I used the illustration in one of our earlier sessions about the man in our church who had a real problem with anger and went around putting his fists through the hollow core doors in his house, and every single hollow core door in his house had a hole in it. So anger, you hit a door and you break your hand, or the bones in your hand, or your wrist. You can internalize stress, and you can grit your teeth, and you can begin over a period of time to have jaw pain, and you do it until it becomes a habitualized thing in your life. You actually train the muscles of your body to do that, and your muscles have a certain muscle memory to them, so that even when you're asleep or unconscious, you're actually gritting your teeth and you have jaw pain as a result of that, which is a response to the pressures that are going on in your life. You can habituate your body to all kinds of things, and your muscles grow used to those sinful, ungodly responses to life. If you ever go to the morgue and see a person before they've been embalmed, that whatever muscle movements they've had in life, they still have after they're dead. They're brain dead, but their body's still moving. You can go to the morgue and see a pianist who has been a pianist all their life, and they're laying there on the slab, and their fingers are still doing this. All right? Why? Because of muscle memory. When I was a boy, we had chickens at our house, and we butchered chickens. All right? What happens when you chop the head off of a chicken? Yeah, it runs around flapping its wings. How's it say? A totally brainless chicken. All right? There's no brain whatsoever in that chicken, and they're still running around the barnyard, flapping its wings and running. Now, how is that possible? Well, because of muscle memories. Well, you have a physical body that you train in a sinful way too. And some of you haven't ridden a bike for years, but when you were a kid, you learned how to ride a bike. If I brought a two-wheel bike, in Australia they call it a push bike. If I brought a push bike in here and you got on it, you feel really awkward. It's been 50 years since I've ridden one of those things, but pretty soon your muscles remember how it went, and pretty soon you're riding that bike and, oh yeah, I remember this now. I remember that because you train your body, and your muscles remember those particular movements. Well, we habituate our bodies to sin in the same way. We do exactly the same thing. And sometimes that has physiological consequences when we do that kind of thing. So, now, I want you to understand at this particular point that God's purpose is more than just us getting well from that sickness. God's purpose is more than just getting well. That's really key. Let's go on to the third thing. I'm going to come back and talk about that in a moment. Also, we find out the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12 that he had a thorn in the flesh. I know that there are many who interpret that to be an actual person. That was a problem in Paul's ministry. There is, however, many commentators who believe that this was an actual physical problem that Paul had. And it's possible. I've gone through that particular passage with a fine-tooth comb in the original language, and it can go either way. I tend to think, because of the terminology that he used, that it's actually a physical element. But that's my only belief. That's my conclusion. I don't think that's a fundamental of faith, so if you stuck a gun to my head, I'd deny it. So I'm not going to hold on to it. But I tend to think that it's a physical ailment. And if that's the case, then the Apostle Paul says he went to the Lord and asked that the Lord would remove this thorn in the flesh, and God kept coming back to him and saying, "My grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in your weakness." So, why? Well, because Paul said that he had received such great revelation from God. He had a tendency, it would feed his pride, his sinful pride in his life, and it was that thorn in the flesh that kept him from becoming so prideful. So prideful. So Paul's thorn keeps him from pride, keeps him from exalting himself. It keeps Paul humble, and he, as a result, has this attitude of humility. and a desire to see God's purposes being fulfilled through that sickness. God's purposes, again, is more important than just getting healed. God's purposes are more important than just getting healed. Or there's another reason for sickness. The glorification of God. You remember in John chapter 9, this is the man who was born blind, and the disciples had the typical Jewish mentality that if a person was born like that, then either he sinned, and they actually had a belief system where a baby could sin in utero, and God, as a result of that, would punish them. So here's a person born blind, or either he sinned or his parents sinned. Well, who sinned that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus said, neither. But this has happened so that God can glorify himself through the healing of that sickness. And Jesus heals him. So God's purpose and glory is more than just getting well. Getting over the illness is not the primary goal. The man born blind had an ailment not because of a sin, but because God's glory might be displayed. So getting over the illness cannot be the primary goal in your life when you become ill. God can be glorified, number one, through the healing. That's certainly possible. Or number two, allowing the sickness to remain. Or number three, by taking the believer home. God can still be glorified in any one of those three ways. So why do we get sick physically? Well, because we live in a world of sin. Sometimes we get sick because it's stuff that we've done to ourselves. Sometimes we're sick because it's keeping us from further sin. And sometimes we're sick so that God can use our life to bring glory to him. Maybe even through our death. I had a wonderful lady who was part of our congregation several years ago. She was one of our deaconesses, and her name was Sue Walters. Never forget Sue. Sue eventually died of breast cancer. And I had the privilege as her pastor to walk her into heaven. That was a great thing. On the last day of her life, she's bleeding from every orifice of her body. Her eyes, her nose, her mouth, her ears. And we're singing hymns of praise as she steps into heaven. What a wonderful, wonderful glorification. And her desire and great prayer was through her death, her husband would come to Christ, her children would come to Christ, and they later did. So, God's glorified, sometimes in taking us home. Sometimes that happens. In Exodus chapter 4 and verse 11, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, who has made man's mouth, or who makes him dumb, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" It's God who does those things. That's not Satan. It's God who does those things. Who is it that does that? Now, the question then comes, what are your responses to what's going on in life? That's a key thing. Because our responses to life can produce sickness in our lives. God created our bodies with certain control mechanisms. We have automatic systems that go on within the body, hormones that work essentially on a basis of supply and demand. Hormones, these are combinations. It's that supply and demand that really makes those hormones function. There are combinations of blinking and breathing that are automatic, but in some cases actually can be controlled a bit. There's certain automatic reflexes that you have in your body as well to certain things that happen. For example, if you were in a dark room and all of a sudden somebody turned on a bright light, you would automatically blink without thinking. You don't have to go out when you go to a exercise class or you go out running or you're exerting some act. You don't have to go out and deliberately think, okay, heart and respiration system, I want the heart to beat more to supply more oxygen. No, you have to do that. It just automatically happens. Those are all automatic controls. that increase your breathing and increase your heart rates in order to supply oxygen and other needed elements to the rest of your body. And there are certain stimuli that produce specific effects. You can touch an electric fence and all of a sudden your muscles immediately react to that. So certain stimuli produces specific results. And some of these controls that are automatic can actually be influenced by our responses to life and problems in life. This gives you a little bit of an illustration. This may be, I don't know whether this may, I think it did make it into your notes, but it may not be very clear. The body is divided down. You see on the left-hand side the parasympathetic system and sympathetic system. All that is part of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic system is essentially when your body is relaxed. What happens? Well, it constricts your pupil. It stimulates salivation. It constricts your bronchial area because you don't need as much oxygen or volume of oxygen going into your body. It stimulates activity in your digestive system, stimulates your gallbladder, constricts your bladder. That's the reason why when you're really relaxed, you feel like using the restroom. And it stimulates sexual structures. It's the reason why you counsel a young man that's having problems with sexual desires and you say to him, go out and run 3 miles. Why? Because that's when the sympathetic system of the body takes over and it helps to reduce that. Let's go over to the sympathetic side. When you're getting your body ready for action or some kind of strenuous exercise, it dilates the pupil and inhibits salivation. You're not thinking about eating so much. Accelerates your heart rate there. It relaxes your bronchial area so that you can suck in greater volume of air. It inhibits activities in your digestive system, stimulates glucose release. There's a secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline in the body, relaxes your bladder, and inhibits sexual structures. That's when you're ready to go. That's the way God's designed us. That's all of those controls. Everything you see there on the parasympathetic side and the sympathetic side can be influenced by your responses to life, how you're dealing with life, how you deal with stress, or the news that you're out of money and you still have to pay the rent. How do you deal with that stress? Those responses to life can produce actual physical symptoms where you start to think about something that's really worrying you and you can almost feel your heart start to pump. Well, you're not getting ready for any activity. Or you internalize that stress deep down inside. And essentially, your bowels are a cross-section of muscles, and you internalize that, and it tenses up the bowels, and you can get a spastic colon from those things. There's nothing physiologically wrong with you. There's nothing physically wrong with you, but because you've internalized that stress, those muscles begin to contract, and they do so much, and they carry that muscle memory in them that you can be at different places, and automatically now your muscles in your colon is now contracting, and this is what they call a spastic colon. All that is not a result of any kind of trigger, physiological trigger in the body. It's because you've internalized all this stress. That's the way you deal with it. On the outside, you may look perfectly calm. Everything's going great. But on the inside, you've internalized all of that, and your muscles are responding to it. This is where the term psychosomatic comes from. That is the way that we think about our life. Psycho, which has to do with soul, comes from the Greek word psyche, somatic. Somata, which is a body. It's the soul's effect upon the body, or how the mind thinks that affects the body. Actually, psychosomatic is an old term. There's a newer term that tries to express it. Psychoneuroimmunology is the new term. Psychoneuroimmunology, because they realize it's a process of the neural system of the body. and responses to life. It can produce certain symptoms. But does it have an organic cause? No, it doesn't. But that internalized stress that's causing your body to do that is training your body to respond to circumstances in your life. Like people that have seemingly panic attacks that come out of nowhere. We had a man in our congregation had the worst panic attacks of anybody I've ever seen. He'd be driving down a freeway and have a panic attack. It would be all he could do to pull the car over, and he would literally sit on the side of the freeway with his hands frozen to the steering wheel of the car for hours until somebody came along and peeled his fingers away from it and picked him up physically out of the car and put him in another car and took him home. His wife knew that if he didn't show up after a period of time, she called people to have him go out and look for him. He's sitting at the side of the road, frozen to the steering wheel. Panic attacks that seemingly come out of nowhere. Or you can be walking through a grocery store and there's no threat. There's no threat in your environment whatsoever. And all of a sudden you feel your heart starting to race. and there's nothing threatening in your environment at all. And the tendency is to think, well, it's a physiological. There was nothing. There's nothing in my environment. And the trigger really comes from your soul, your mind. And your body's been trained to that. Been trained to that trigger. Now, there are actual physiological problems that can cause panic-like attacks, but those are correctable through surgery. But most panic attacks are not caused by a physical problem. They're caused by how a person processes life. So, it's interesting here. What about the frequency of these things? Well, what is interesting is 30 to 50% of patients seen by the average primary care physician have physical symptoms with no organic cause. Now, I don't say that. Medical textbooks say that. 30 to 50% of patients seeing the average primary care physician have physical symptoms with no organic cause. Wow. Gastroenterologists say that 40% of people who have functional bowel syndrome have physical symptoms with no organic cause. That would mean that 40% of the people that see a gastroenterologist have spiritual problems going on that's causing physical problems. The cause is spiritual. And the way that you respond to certain things in life may aggravate diseases that are already present. 25 to 30% of patients, they say that's true. You have already a pre-existing disease or problem, and now your responses or your poor responses to life or unbiblical responses to life now are just compounding those problems physically. Medical treatment, then you take medicine, but that just slows down the brain stimulus to the organ. And at this particular point, a placebo effect is very, very evident and is very revealing. In this particular case, the problem is not your problem. It's your response to the problems of life that is really the problem. How am I responding to things in my life? How am I processing things in life? You ever been in a situation where you really didn't like going there, but you had to? Maybe it's your job. You don't really like going there. You say, and you come home and say to your wife, every time I go there, I get sick. Well, there's nothing there that causes sickness. It's just your thinking. And every time I go there, I just feel sick to my stomach. As soon as I walk away, I'm fine. I walk back, it's got to be in the air. Can't be me. No, it's you. Affects how you feel, how you respond to life. You can't necessarily change your circumstances, but you can change your response to your circumstances. That's so critical. your response to those circumstances. That's vitally important to understand. So how are you responding to the adverse circumstances that are going on in your life? Well, that's a good question, which brings us to our next issue. How do I respond to it? Well, then we have to evaluate it from the reasons that were given. Is it sin engendered? Is that the problem? Have I had a poor discipline or a poor stewardship of my body? I've developed some sinful habits in my body that have brought about autonomic-like responses. I've trained the muscles of my body to respond to stressful situations so that they react this way. What's happening? Or is this problem that I'm experiencing there in order to prevent further sin in my life? Is that it? Maybe it's dealing with my pride. I always pride myself in being rather healthy. Well, maybe it's my pride. And it's also something that you need to pray about and really commit to Christ. Or is this there to glorify God? Can I die with God's grace? Trusting God all the way through the illness, right to the very end. Is that possible? And how can this illness be used in order to glorify God? We've got to recognize the truth of John 9:3, that some illnesses are there. What glorifies God ultimately is what is best for the sick person. And yet a lot of people will do anything they can for a cure. They're on a hunt to find testimonials of possible cures. Multiple sclerosis. My sister is a research nurse for the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. And she works in the area of multiple sclerosis. They're testing out all kinds of things to see what's best type of treatment and the newer drugs that are coming along. And sometimes she keeps me up on all the different stuff that's going on in the MS area. So let's say, for instance, you have multiple sclerosis. There's no known cure for that particular disease, but people will try and take every potential test, drug, every potential vitamin in order to find a possible cure. They'll go all over the earth. They'll hear about some remote testimony of some Amazon jungle tribe that has no occurrences of multiple sclerosis, and they'll move there and start eating their diet. You know, they'll do weird, bizarre things as if all we have is the here and now. No. They could be spending their latter days on earth, making things right with family members, learning to glorify God in those ways. Listen, here's the good news. We're all going to die. That's the good news. I'll get to be with my Savior. That's the good news. We're all going to die. That's why I tell the medical doctors in our church, I say to them, wow, you have got to work in one of the most depressing situations of any job because you're going to fail 100% of the time. Every single one of your patients are going to die eventually. How would you like to work in a job where you failed 100% of the time? Oh, that'd be really discouraging. So that's the way people are. We're going to die. That's the way it is. So I want to die as best as possible to glorify God in that way. When I was in South Africa back a few years ago, I met with there was about 100 black pastors that had come out of the bush. And we had a Q&A session. I'll never forget, one of those dear elderly black pastors raised his hand. He says, what do you do if you have a congregation of 400 people and you know in the next 5 years almost all of them are going to be gone? They're going to be dead. I never thought about that. I thought, wow, you probably could answer this better than I could. But I thought about it a little bit, and I said to him, Well, I guess I would spend my time teaching them how to die well. How to die? See, the AIDS epidemic has really swept through. And they're coming out of the tribal system, and what the news doesn't tell you is that polygamy is what's really causing the AIDS epidemic to really swell, because you've got one man and he's got 14 wives, and usually if he has AIDS, then the rest of his wives have AIDS, but they don't want to, the sociologists don't want to mess with the tribal system and mess up the polygamy that goes on there, so they don't talk about that at all, but that's the thing that's killing them. They don't want to talk about that kind of thing. So, what do you do if you minister in that kind of environment? That's really a death environment. Everybody in your congregation is going to be gone in the next 4 or 5 years. Well, if I'm going to pastor a congregation like that, we're all going to learn how to die well. We're all going to learn how to die to the honor and glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. Got to do that. So, you have to recognize the truth of John 9:3. You have to evaluate your personal goals in life. What are your personal goals? What is really most important to you? Again, what glorifies God is best for the sick person. Is it your goal to get well, or is it your goal to glorify God? Luke chapter 10, Mary and Martha, you know that story. Martha was busy with the things of this life, Jesus says. That's the way a lot of people are who are sick. They're busy with the things of this life. That means that's their focus. John 4:34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work, Jesus said. That should be our will. 1 Timothy 4:7, on the other hand, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. So you get all of these passages that are really critical. I love what Job 2:10 says. In fact, back in 1985, when my father was dying of myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a form of leukemia, he could tell I wasn't taking his death well. He looked up from his bed and he said to me, John, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Those are the words of Job to his wife, right? Whoa. Are we going to say, we're going to be fair weather Christians and say, Lord, as long as you send good things my way, everything's going to be great. But the moment you allow bad things to come into my life, all bets are off. That's fair weather Christianity. That's not real Christianity at all. Job 2:10. Or the remarkable statement by Joseph there in Genesis 50:20 to his brothers, right? After all they had done to him, robbed him of his teenage years with his father, he says to them, now he's got power over them. As a leader in Egypt, he says to them, shall we accept our, you intended all this for evil, but God intended it for good, the saving of many lives. You intended all this for evil. God always promises that his will be glorified in our lives. He doesn't necessarily promise deliverance. Funny story of Johnny Erickson Tata and John MacArthur. Interesting story. After John MacArthur had carried her up several years ago, this happened. A flight of stairs, he put her in a wheelchair, but in the process of doing so, he lost his balance and fell on her arm. Well, she can't feel her arm, obviously. She said, wow. She said, I'll bet that hurt. God had brought her from a standpoint of accepting her quadriplegic state to actually embracing it. She had embraced it. She could actually joke about it. I wonder how many of us could do that. I'll bet that hurt. Well, you can see here then as well that you've got to be responsible no matter how you feel. No matter how you feel. You have a disease, then what does God want you to do about it? Are you upset? Are you angry? How are you processing that particular problem? What if you have something that medicine has not discovered yet? Then God has a purpose in that too. We still have a responsibility to obey Him. And as a good steward, we're not going to spend all of our time and money trying to find some kind of cure. And yet, that's exactly what a lot of people do. I love to ask counselees 3 questions at this particular point. Question number 1 is, could God have stopped this? And the answer is always what? Yes. Yes, He could have. Question number 2, did He? The obvious answer is no. He could have, but He didn't. Question number 3, then what is God's purpose in this? What is God's purpose in this? Could God have stopped this? Whatever disease, whatever problem you have? Well, yes. Did He? No. Then what is God's purpose in you having this disease? There is a divine purpose in this. Again, God's purposes is far more than just getting the sick person well. You say, okay, we've talked about all these physical diseases, you've talked about sicknesses and all this stuff, but what about stuff like chemical imbalances? What about that? Well, let's talk about that. There are specific medical issues here that are important. Now, a chemical imbalance, gives you a little bit of an example here of neurons in the brain. And neuron is a fascinating cell of the body, unlike all the other cells of your body, like a liver cell or a cell in your kidneys or a cell at the end of your big toe. These particular cells have the capacity to carry on constant communication with one another. One neuron can carry over 1,000 different conversations with nearby neurons at the same time. Now, I know some of you are good at talking, but try to do that. Carry on simultaneous 1,000 different conversations. That's one neuron in your brain, and you have almost 100 billion of them in your brain. That rivals the number of stars in the Milky Way. The brain is probably the most complex thing that we know in our organic and physical environment. It's unbelievable. Makes you think there's a God there. And it's comprised of all these neurons. And these neurons have axons and dendrites. Axons are those little tentacles that grow out from your neurons that carry messages away from the neuron. Dendrites are the chemical or little tentacles that carry the message into the neuron. And there's a little space between the end of an axon and the beginning of a dendrite called the synaptic cleft. And there's a chemical in that little space. And there's little chemicals that are sent from the end of that axon. And if you were to blow this up, and I think there's an example of it there in your notes, it would look something like this. There's little chemicals at the end of the axon that are known as serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. And in that little space in between, in that synaptic cleft, there is another chemical called monoamine oxidase. And that little chemical sort of acts like the theory is in chemical imbalances, a killer whale that comes along and consumes all the norepinephrine or the serotonin or the dopamine that's communicated from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another neuron. Goes around and consumes it, absorbs it. When that particular process is interrupted, this is what they theorize. Nobody knows exactly for sure. That's the process that they theorize occurs in chemical imbalances. And so that's the reason why they give antidepressants to people who supposedly have this chemical imbalance in order to the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors in order to encourage a better communication or connection between those axons and dendrites. And now all my neurons, you'll hear people say, are firing. That means they're all connecting. All the messages are coming together. And the theory is the reason why people who are depressed are confused, they can't focus, they can't concentrate, is that there's that interruption that's going on there. But, in fact, here's a good illustration of this, a Pfizer illustration. Neurons have specialized projection called dendrites and axons. Dendrites bring information to the neuron cell body, and axons take information away from the neuron cell body. Incoming information is received by the dendrites and passes through the neuron cell body and through the axon of the neuron. For communication between neurons to occur, an electrical impulse must travel down the axon to the synaptic terminal. The problem with that is most researchers now say that's very simplistic. You'll hear pop psychologists, and you'll hear a lot of people and even a lot of Christians talk about chemical imbalances, but most researchers now are saying chemical imbalances is a very, very poor way of describing it. It's a very simplistic way. They think that the reason why people have phobias and the reason people struggle with depression is because of the limbic brain. The limbic brain essentially is the hypothalamus and the amygdala are two parts of the brain that many believe are implicated in depressive and anxiety disorders. Why do they think that? Well, it's small areas of the brain. The hypothalamus governs thirst, appetite, sleep, pleasure, sexual desire, and aggression. Those are the body's functions that are most affected in depression. So they think it's not really a neuron issue anymore. The real, more popular idea is it's a malfunction of the hypothalamus, which governs all those areas. Because when a person becomes depressed, either they don't have any thirst, or they have a lot of thirst, or they don't have any appetite, or they have a lot of appetite, or they don't sleep well, or they don't experience much pleasure, or they don't have much sexual desire, or they have way too much sexual desire, or they're very passive, or they're extremely aggressive. So that seems to be extremes that are governed by the hypothalamus. The amygdala is another part. It's believed that it controls the brain's ability to react in fear, which is implicated in anxiety disorders. So when a person has a panic attack, then that would essentially be a part of the amygdala. The amygdala malfunctions for some reason. But again, nobody knows for sure, absolutely. So there's still a lot of debate on why do these things really happen. It's almost as if, in order to find out for sure, you'd have to kill the patient to find out what's really causing their depression. But as soon as you do that, then you lose the opportunity to tell what's really causing the depression. Now, regardless of what happens here or what they ultimately conclude, the question is, which came first, depression or the imbalance? Now, I want you to notice what the Bible says and answer that question. Take your Bible just for a moment. Let's go over to Proverbs 14 and verse 30. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 30. A tranquil heart is life to the body, but passion is rottenness to the bone. The Hebrew word for passion here is a word that can be translated, or the idea is internal turmoil. You know, upset. Sometimes we say internal passion, upset, internal turmoil. But passion is rottenness to the bones, is the idea. Or Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 30. Bright eyes gladden the heart, good news put fat on the bones. So how we process life in our spirit, our soul, and by the way, there is no distinction between spirit and soul. They're basically the immaterial part of man. When you study soul and spirit throughout the Bible, the spirit is that immaterial part of man out of connection with the body. The soul is that immaterial part of man in connection with the body. That's the biblical distinction between the two. But both of them refer to the immaterial part of man. So when my soul is not processing things well, then it has effect upon my body. Passion is rottenness to the bones. Or Proverbs chapter 17 And verse 22, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. That's a person who's crushed, who has no hope. Broken spirit, oftentimes it's descriptive in old ancient Hebrew terminology of a person who's really severely depressed. Dries up the bone. In other words, it has an effect upon the physical health of the body. We know that a depressed person over a long period of time that's chronically depressed, it suppresses the immune system, and those people tend to be more sickly than other people. We know that. In fact, that part is measurable. And the Bible confirms that. The Bible says the spirit's condition, the soul's condition, has a huge effect on how the body responds to life circumstances. Well, then the question comes, do drugs work? Well, that's a great question. But you got to define, what do you mean by work? And this is where we get into the problem of the placebo effect. I mentioned to you earlier in one of the sessions the St. John Wort story about the work that had been done and reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the St. John Wort study. There is also a study that was done in the American Journal of Psychiatry on the functional anatomy of a placebo effect that asks this question: do placebos, when they alleviate depressive symptoms, produce actual changes in the brain? Well, the answer to that study was a simple yes. I'm not going to go through all the statistics of it, but yes, a placebo changes the chemicals in a brain. And then the study goes on and says any kind of talk therapy they've been able to measure also changes the chemicals in the brain. So the reality is that placebos and talk therapies, such as biblical counseling, also changes brain chemistry. In fact, talk therapy gives a person a new disposition, a new view of life that actually changes the chemical components of the brain. That's interesting. And then the St. John Wort study, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that examines the effectiveness of placebos to relieve depressive symptoms as compared with other treatments for depression. In this carefully designed study, 340 depressed men and women were divided into three groups. 113 were given St. John Wort, which is a natural medication given primarily for depression. 116 were given placebos, and 111 were given Zoloft, which is, of course, a well-known antidepressant. And after 8 weeks of treatment, all three groups improved with no statistical difference among them. All three groups improved. Now, one single study cannot establish the validity of an observation, but according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, this study is not alone. This is what they say. Let me quote JAMA for you. They say, an increasing number of studies have failed to show a difference between active antidepressants and a placebo. End of quote, page 1813. Did you hear what they said? This is a Journal of the American Medical Association. An increasing number of studies have failed to show any difference between an active antidepressant and a placebo. So, the placebo effect, when it's in pill form, is increasing at a rate, they go on to say, of about 7% each decade. In other words, if 30% of the people, of depressed people responded to placebos in 1970, 50% of that group would respond to them today. So we're placing greater, as decade after decade goes by, greater and greater trust in medication to solve the problem. Such use of placebo suggests that as a culture, we're putting more and more hope in our pills. The placebo effect is a measure of our confidence, the trust that we place in a particular object. Those who put their trust in witch doctors might die from his voodoo threats because they believe in witch doctors. Those who trust in pills might report some healing from placebos because they believe in the medication. As long as psychiatric medications are perceived as the deepest treatment for depression, the placebo effect will flourish. Whoa. It will flourish. So, do they work? What do you mean by work? If we're talking about work in the sense of, does it cure the problem, the organic disorder, then it doesn't work, because as soon as the medicine wears off, the organic or the problem is back. Most medications, in order to work, has to cure the problem. It has to do that. So there's no active ingredients in a placebo. Things you have to consider is the patient, the medical doctor or a psychiatrist caring for the patient, and whether or not the patient feels that they're being cared for. The environment makes a difference in the effects of the placebo as well. All of these are key. So what's really going on? You have problems that are going on in life. You have certain responses to those particular problems that maybe are unbiblical thinking and poor attitudes, and those particular problems then produce bad attitudes in your life, which slows the life down. There's decreased functioning, which now just increases the problems that are going on in your life. And so what's often introduced to that is some kind of drug or placebo effect, and now I start to feel a lot better because I have a drug that helps me. So I feel better. So it works. It helps me. What do you mean by work? Well, then, here's some questions to ask. And this is often we'll give to counselees who are seeing physicians who claim a physical problem like chemical imbalance, or maybe even if they're really up on things, there's a malfunction of the hypothalamus or the amygdala. It's producing emotional or behavior problems. Concerning the diagnosis, what tests were run to prove a physical symptom is present? That's a question. Good question. How do these tests prove the presence of that? Is the condition proven, demonstrable fact, or simply a theory? What about the behavior? Well, how do you know that the diagnosed physical problem is the cause of the emotion or behavior or actions of the person? Is the link proven, a demonstrable fact, or simply a theory? Concerning medication, what proof do you have that the medicine that you're recommending corrects the physical problem? Sometimes, if it's only treating the symptoms, it's like giving a person an anesthetic who's sitting on a tack. They feel better, say, it's working, the medicine's working. But as soon as the anesthetic wears off, guess what? Ouch! The tack is still there. What do you mean it worked? Now you got to remember, as a counselor, it's not our job to practice medicine. You didn't put them on the medication, and it's not your place to take them off of it. Work with a medical physician, not in place of one. When a person is under care or the authority of a medical doctor, it's unethical to overrule that authority, especially in an area where you're not trained. However, if a medical doctor is dedicated to constantly frustrating or refuting the theological counseling that you're giving to the counselee, an area where he or she has little or no training, then make sure your counselee finds a different doctor, hopefully a doctor that will work with you and not against you. I remember several years ago as a pastor back in the Ohio area, we had a secular doctor who didn't buy into all the psychobabble that was out there. And so I'd send all my counselees to him. I'd say, now you got to go and witness to him. And he loved it. He loved getting the patients. All right? But he wouldn't put them on heavy psychotropic drugs. He let me work with them using good biblical help. And then at the same time, he would treat their actual physical problems. You may have to find a physician that will work with you in that. In this area, we've trained a number of doctors through our graduate program in biblical counseling. After getting their doctorates, and they've come to masters, and a number of doctors and nurses all the way throughout the Southern California area. So there you go. That's a quick overview to kind of help you with dealing with the physiological problems.